main thing you lack is love. Let's look at some of the Greek words for love. They were much more careful in their vocabulary than we are. We just use love for anything, almost anything. But they had different words for it. And there were three aspects of love that they had which we need to grasp. There was the love which was sexual attraction, to lust, to be physically attracted. But they even had two words for that, one of which was good and one of which was bad. The good word for sexual attraction was eros, a name falsely given to that aluminium statue in Piccadilly Circus, which should actually be called agape because it's a memorial to Lord Shaftesbury, and it's the angel of mercy, not Cupid. But there it is, everybody knows eros in Piccadilly. Eros, from which we get erotic. And then their bad word was epithumia. That was a dustbin word for the worst kind of lust. Eros is not necessarily a bad word. I just want to point that out, but epithumia really is. And Paul often lists epithumia as the wrong sexual attraction, which is just purely promiscuous. And that is based on mutual attraction. Some people attract that in you and some people don't. It is essentially a thing of the flesh, of the body, the shape of the body. It is essentially an emotional love, and it is a dependent love. It's dependent on that object continuing to attract your lust. And as soon as that stops, then you no longer have that for that person. And I'm afraid many marriages based on that alone, as soon as the attraction goes, with age, then the love goes. It is, in a sense, basically sexual love. Then they had another word, Philadelphia, from philo and adelphia, brother, which means to like someone. It's a word of affection rather than attraction. It's essentially a word of like-mindedness. You know, you have friends that you get on with because you have similar tastes and outlook. It's an affection, it's brotherly love. And it can happen between two men and between two women. By the way, when eros happens, it is between a man and a woman, but epithumia can be between two men and two women, homosexual. But this is an affection. It is essentially a thing of two minds that like each other and have sympathy and empathy with each other. It's therefore essentially an intellectual thing. I don't mean by that academic, but I mean a thing of thoughts. And it is interdependent. You depend on each other. On each other's thoughts and tastes and interests. Then there is this word which the Greeks very rarely used because they hardly ever saw it. And agape love is a love of attention. It's a love that gives attention to people. It is not a love that is attracted by them or a mutual interdependent affection. It is a love that simply gives attention, that takes notice of someone. It's therefore primarily an act of the will. You decide to agape someone. Someone you notice nobody is caring for. You decide to go and give your attention to them. That can happen in a meeting like this. You know, some people will be naturally drawn to each other. There'll be Philadelphia here. If there's agape, then somebody may notice that somebody else is on their own and nobody's talked to them. And just, they decide, they're not particularly attracted to that person, but they just say, nobody's talking to that person, I'll go and talk to them. That's agape. It's a love of attention. And it's a love of the will that you decide to do it. And therefore, alone of all these three, this can be commanded. Thou shalt love. You can't command that kind of love. You can't say to two people, you shall like each other. See? And you can't say to a man and a woman, you shall fall in love. But you can tell them to agape each other. Do you see? It is therefore a volitional love of the will that can be commanded, that you can command yourself to do, and therefore is quite independent of the person you're loving. The person you're loving doesn't need to be attractive or affectionate or even thankful. You heal the leper whether he says thank you or not, because you agape them. Now the Greeks rarely use this word because You rarely find it in people. You find an awful lot of that in the world, and you find quite a lot of that. Very little of this. Very little. And yet this is the love of God. That's not. God doesn't love us because we're attractive. Not because we're lovable. He loves us because he loves us, says the Bible. Why does he love the Jews? You find this in the Old Testament, not because they're a great nation, but because God is love. And he chose to care for them. A bunch of slaves whom nobody cared about. God said, I'm going to care. The word care is much nearer agape than the word love. And this was what they lacked. This is a sacrificial, that's a sexual love, this is a social love, this is a sacrificial love that is willing to pay any price to care for someone. Amazing love. And this is the love that God had for us, that while we were yet sinners, God agape'd us. And that introduced a new dimension of love. And where that is lacking in a church, you will inevitably split a church when spiritual gifts appear. And the reason why so many churches have been divided over charismatic things is precisely the lack of agape. It is not spiritual gifts that divide. It is the lack of agape. Because agape is sacrificial love. Agape doesn't vaunt itself, is not puffed up, does not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not its own. Agape doesn't boast. Agape doesn't say, I've got a gift. Agape doesn't think it's better than anyone else. Agape seeks all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And if you've got agape, you can cope with spiritual gifts. But if you haven't, boy, they're dangerous. See? And maturity is to grow in love. Now abideth faith, hope, and agape. Not faith, hope, and eros, and not faith, hope, and Philadelphia. There are plenty of warm fellowship churches where there's a lot of affection because you've got a lot of like-minded people. You know, they're a religious club of people who have similar tastes in music and worship. That's not agape. Agape is where you've got a lot of differences, and yet you care for each other. And you can live with that. Well, that's just a little exposition of 1 Corinthians 13.